All right. So all of these presentations in this session and spilling over into the afternoon are all examples of slum mapping, poverty mapping, all from within the Idea Maps network, which I think is really exciting. You'll see there's actually a lot of diversity in how different groups at different time periods as the project has evolved with different resourcing and all that, different ways that we've tried to operationalize the kind of big picture values and aspirations that we talked about this morning. So not in any particular order, these are the next set of speakers: Ryan Maxwell, Monica Kufer from University of Twente, Francis Oninyambu, who from African and Population Health Research Center, who might not be able to join because he had a family emergency that he just messaged about, so we'll be in touch with him in a bit. And somebody else from the network can help cover his slides, not a problem. And I'll speak later. Apologies for the poor coloring. Clearly some template got applied, but this is a picture of a tree with a bunch of different project logos on it. This is what we're calling the family tree of Idea Maps projects, which really started, the group started forming and having discussions as early as 2018. We got our first bit of money it kicked off in April 2020, which was perfect timing for a networking effort to bring people together from around the globe. Because of course it all had to happen online. Lots of engagement though did happen. And I think that some of us became kind of like very casual friends from across continents. So that's the Idea Maps networking grant, which really kind of spawned off all of these other different projects that are more mapping methods oriented. And you can't see the arrows, but there's the Idea Maps project, Slum Map, the European Space Agency Idea Atlas project, the Gates Foundation Data Ecosystem project will all be discussed by our presenters today. We came together really as on the sidelines of other meetings and workshops and conferences. So all of us were interested in slum mapping in some way, but came from very different backgrounds. We had people who are mapping slum boundaries and characteristics in their own communities, so field mappers. There was people like Dennis coming from a census survey, government household survey-based or census-based definition of a slum household and SDG monitoring. We have people like Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Red Cross, Red Crescent, humanitarian sector, thinking about vulnerabilities and responding to vulnerable places and populations. And then a bunch of folks like the people that you're hearing from today who are much more in the academic space on the data science, quantitative modeling, AI, machine learning approaches side of things. When we started this effort, we were really working toward this goal of a degree of deprivation map at fine scale. We were thinking 100-meter resolution, which is about the size of a city block, with the concept of obfuscating exact boundaries of slums and informal settlements, covering enough people that you wouldn't be putting specific households at risk, but still providing kind of a spatial granularity that could be useful for decision support. And this was corroborated with various engagement activities where we were asked and interacted with data in multiple different projects in different ways. And this resolution does pretty good at kind of giving that spatial resolution while obfuscating exact boundaries. So that's where we started as a network. But I also want to flag a few other, the coloring here stinks, flag a few other frameworks that are really helpful background knowledge if you're kind of new to this world of slum mapping. One is a seminal report that came out of UN Habitat as they were kicking off the MDG monitoring and kind of working into that definition of a slum household and then operationalizing it to make estimates globally about how many slum-like populations do we have and where are they. This report is awesome. It's very much from a policy planning perspective. It's qualitative, it's narrative, but they do a really nice job framing out kind of aspects of what defines a slum, related to things like origins and age, which start thinking about your spatial data, buildings data, origins and age, right? You can start thinking about what that would look like in terms of a buildings data set. Location, contextual features, what is around the space that we're focused on? How far is it from something? What are the other, is it around things that are like itself, or is it around things that are not like itself? Size and scale of the slum settlement, and also the legality or kind of level of vulnerability of the settlement. There's some really nice language there. They don't give they don't give an exact typology of slums, but there are certainly people who've used this report to develop a pretty straightforward, like 10 to 15 kind of categories that are referenced regularly in the text, with things like inner city slums, slum estates, squatter settlements. These are kind of terms that are used regularly in the report that kind of cross these different definitions. And there's really great text that can help you start thinking about how you would represent this in terms of spatial data, Earth observation data, GIS data. Another really important framework is Diani Colis led this work from University of Twente in 2012, which is super cool because buildings data and roads data that's kind of global in coverage with the kind of height characteristics and some of the other more kind of attributes that are being connected to these data sets are all just coming together in the last like 3 years, right? And she published this like over a decade ago, and it's still, it might be more relevant now and really exciting to think about what all the things we could do to operationalize this with the data that are now available. The concept is really simple and is actually very much related to that typology of slums from UN Habitat. From this perspective, in a geospatial kind of operationalization of urban poverty, you would have the attributes related to the environment, the location and neighborhood characteristics, the settlement shape and density, and objects within settlements, like the road network and the building characteristics, basically. And this is a way to think about defining slums. Another, which I think is very useful framework, is something that came out of the first Idea Maps project, where we did a very detailed literature review with experts from very, very different backgrounds. And we had the deep social science people and the deep GIS, Earth observation, remote sensing people working on simultaneous reviews and integrating the results. We were looking for different measures of poverty, urban poverty, and different definitions in time and space. Yeah, it's a very long article. There's a lot of analysis in it. But this, I think, is a really useful framework that came out. The concept here is that any kind of urban poverty anywhere in the world, whether it's Washington, D.C., or Nairobi, or a small city like, Kisumu, or a smaller city like this, the urban poverty is defined by some combination of these buckets, and that the specific indicators in these buckets will be very dependent on the context, but the same common thread will be there. So a really easy one to think about is physical hazards and assets. If you live on a steep slope in Rio de Janeiro, you probably are in something that looks like a slum or impoverished area. If you live in a flood zone in Dhaka, Bangladesh, then you probably live in it. And those are both environmental hazards, right? But they look very differently in the different contexts. Two of these are within household measures. Anything that's measured in a household survey or a census is generally measuring some kind of phenomena that affects individuals. And we can aggregate that up and say something about all individuals in an area, but it's still an individual attribute, right? So those are all things that tend to fall in the social science definitions of poverty, including our current slum household definition. There's also things that have to do with measuring the environment. And those are all things I've put a big box around, because those are things we might think about measuring with Earth observation and spatial GIS data. And governance is there as well. This is often a city level attribute, like the same governance structure will apply to all areas within the city, so you wouldn't see any variation from one neighborhood to the next. That's not entirely true. Larger cities, of course, have wards or sub-districts or something. There might be some variance. And so you could think about actually mapping out a spatial distribution at the sub-city scale. The data are much harder to come by, but in principle, that's where it would fit. And these are three that if we're thinking about SDG monitoring, if we're thinking about kind of basic housing and housing services, that would be an important starting point for communities and local governments. Those are the three buckets that I would personally focus on first, with buildings and roads being some kind of core starting points. Okay, I've got two more slides and then I'll hand it off. We have been talking a little bit in the first session about these kind of feedback loops between communities, local governments, and the data people. There's been a couple different pictures of what this might look like and how we're conceptualizing it. This is from the very kind of inception of the initial projects, where you have this like backbone of like data and a local data infrastructure that like kind of is replicated in different places, and that different types of stakeholders from neighborhoods, from cities, and national stakeholders are kind of feeding stuff in, getting stuff out, validating stuff, and getting, you know, more value out of the whole system. That's one conceptualization. I will say that the use cases in green are not that well fleshed out. I think that we were making some big, broad gestured assumptions. If you ask me today what needs to go in like a neighborhood stakeholder kind of application, it would be demolition, prevention, response, and recovery, like that top box up there, not some kind of general advocacy bucket. But this is a published framework. And this is a more recent update to like kind of thinking about the process and the platforms for getting feedback on modeled data. In this picture, we have all the data stuff in the middle, where you've got lots of data coming in. It's getting anonymized and standardized and kind of integrated. There's like some training data that we've worked really hard to somehow get in some kind of common format, which has been really one of the sticking points. I think Monica will talk about that. And then we have some more kind of general modeled approaches of what we do with this. And we have these kind of general outputs of maps and data visualizations that are useful to communities and policymakers at local levels. And that because they're using them, they're able to somehow give some validation and feedback if they don't see something, if something doesn't make sense. That validation gets captured and reintegrated as training data, for example. Let's say, like I said, that modeled output was wrong. Let me correct it. That gets captured, anonymized, standardized, and integrated. That's the concept. And that we're also bringing in all this other kind of authoritative global EO kind of data. I think over the next couple of weeks, I think a lot of us in the Idea Maps network might want to think about how we could update this or make it more specific, but that's where I'll leave it. And I'm going to pass it off to Maxwell next, and then Monica after.